us is Brian Cameron from the Liberal Party of Canada.
Well, first of all, I'd like to reiterate that the Holocaust was atrocious. What happened, and also what happened to the First Nations, the original people of this land, was atrocious and disgusting, and it was genocide. I do support a law criminalizing it the same way that the Holocaust denialism is, because I just think that we as Canadians, it's already been put forward by our government that it was a genocide against First Nations people. It hurt so many people. I met a woman in Courtney the other day when I was collecting signatures, and this lovely woman, her mother passed away in childbirth. Her father drowned, and then at age 6, she was sent up to Alert Bay to the residential schools. She was in the residential school up there until she was 16, and she got out of there, and she told me it took her until she was 40 to heal. And she's now a strong, amazing woman. I was blown away listening to her story. She went and walked on the ground of that residential school up in Alert Bay. And there is no denying that there was a genocide against the First Nations of this people. And one thing to correlate between the Holocaust and the genocide against the First Nations in Canada is that Donald Campbell was the first Indian Affairs Minister of Canada. He was actually the gentleman who coined the term the final solution. It has been part of the destruction of the First Nations had been started in the early days of Canada, and I am staunchly against it, and I think we need to stand up for side by side with our First Nations and take action on the 94 calls to action.
Chris Martin, Green Party.
Thank you very much for the question. I just want to acknowledge and reiterate that any genocide out in the world, whether it's Turtle Island to Palestine to Yemen to the Congo, must be called out and must be exposed for what it is, and that is a genocide. So genocide denialism, whether we're talking about the Holocaust, whether we're talking about in Canada, should and always should be a crime, because the genocide itself is in a lot of places is still going on, and we're still having conversations even in this election about whether or not the genocide is even happening. So we need to really bring into the 21st century our view on what is and what is not acceptable. In Germany, it has been a crime since the Second World War to show Nazi symbolism. It is a capital offense, and we don't do anything close to that here. And even in the States, there are still states even now that fly Confederate flags. And we need to set a much better standard here. We need to renew and honor our commitments to UNDRIP and the TRC's 94 recommendations that were put out. Senator John Sinclair did an amazing job of putting forward a document that set the goals out very clearly and very deliberately, and it would behoove all of us here, especially as settlers on stolen land, to do everything that we can to condemn genocide whenever and wherever we see it. Thank you.
George John ZDP.
Well, first, like my colleague here said, you can't compare genocides. The Holocaust was evil and wicked. And we all know that it's hate speech if you are not condemning, if you try to deny that the Holocaust existed. But the reality is, when it comes to residential school systems, that it was clear in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that it was cultural genocide. And when we sit and listen to survivors in our community, you know that it was genocide. And it doesn't take a long time for you to hear the stories about the suffering, the deaths that took place, the long-lasting systemic impact that has had on people in our communities and in the nations across Canada, and the impact that's had. My colleague Leah Kazan tabled a bill to make it denialism of the residential schools illegal. not seeing Chris McNichol, why we're not seeing Conservatives showing up for any debates across Canada, is because we have a question. Is Chris McNichol support Aaron Gunn, who's a denialist, a residential school, genocidal denialist? And we need to know. You need to know. You deserve to know. Indigenous people deserve to know. They have every right to know. And we need to hear from Chris McNichol on this. Because he's in a lot of photos with Aaron Gunn. And it's harmful. It's harmful to Indigenous peoples. It's harmful to the survivors. It's harmful to their families. And this needs to be included in the criminal code. It needs to be hate speech. And we need to move forward with that. And I'm really proud of my colleague. And I'm proud of my colleagues from all parties that supported a unanimous motion identifying it as genocide.
That was fun.
Let's do that again.
All right. The problem with putting anything like this into the criminal code is that it restricts our very basic freedoms of expression, which is right there against the charter. Even our hate speech laws as they currently exist probably shouldn't exist, because then we don't actually have freedom of expression, we only have licensed expression. It's only what the government approves of. So what happens when the government gets in that decides, instead of denialism, it's the affirmation, right? If it's, turn it around on its head. If, if it's illegal one day for, somebody in government to decide what opinions you're allowed to hold or express, and especially ones where the historical record may be murky, or at the very least it needs to be discussed to find out what's actually going on. Yes, I've heard a lot of the horror stories, and I haven't looked into it as much as I would like, but I've also heard the other side of people who didn't necessarily have issues with the residential schools or experiences in let's say, being taken off the reservation when they were younger, which I'm not clearly expressing, but again, there's multiple sides to the story. A lot of what we've been fed in the last few years around this has a lot of murkiness to it, and to all of a sudden make that into a criminal offense is repugnant to our rights and freedoms. Thank you. Jesse Musial, Christian Heritage Party.
Because I know it makes you cheer.
Well, again, thank you for the question. I just acknowledge that this is a very sensitive topic in our Canadian culture, and for good reason. When we received the question, the first thing I wanted to do is just look up a literal definition of genocide. And there's a few different ones that come up. There is a genocide is violence that targets individuals because of their membership in a group. This one from from an EU website, an act committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. That is a very broad definition, and I think I would agree with some other candidates up here that comparing this directly with the Holocaust is a bit of an uneven comparison, but it begs the question, of language. Words are powerful, words have meaning, and how we use them matters. And so I do think that, according to this definition, the residential school, the history of residential schools in this country could absolutely be labeled as a genocide. I do believe that a much smaller incident could also be labeled as a genocide, and we have to be careful not to do injustice to different events by giving them the same label. That being said, I want to iterate a very brief story that I think is very relevant to this conversation. A friend of mine was in a car accident. They had to decide how hard to fight with their lawyers, with ICBC, to try to get the compensation that they were served. They were clearly not at fault. But I was trying to advise this person, and a friend of mine said, you have to be careful when your mission is to label yourself as a victim, when that is your, when you're given the message that you need to define yourself as someone who has been wronged, that all of your effort goes into proving that you have been wronged, and your effort does not go into trying to pick yourself up and move forward with the greatest strength that you can. That being said, I think that we can do a great harm to our First Nations and to any group of people by encouraging them to focus primarily on what has been done wrong to them. Thank you.
Teresa Knight, Animal Protection Party.
So I'm kind of on the fence about this one. I am for freedom of speech and not making illegal saying this, that, or the other thing. I didn't realize that Holocaust denialism was illegal. The problem with making anything like that illegal is you can come up with a situation like suddenly appeared in the States where that poor pro-Palestinian student was suddenly illegal for being pro-Palestinian and got exported from the country. So it's a fine line. Yes, I think if somebody is